So next up is the lovely Sancho. I'm a big fan of Sancho's, if you didn't know. So a lot of what Sancho has done in the Power Platform around styling has been transformative. And there's an awful lot of information out there about how you can use the stuff that Sancho has put out. But today, it's like not just talking about design, but kind of the whole topic, right, Sancho?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of little bits and pieces of productivity that people don't necessarily think about, especially if they're not in the trenches building apps every day. And there's a lot of little things that you can do that over the longer term just make your whole life a lot easier and more productive. And I've got a few of them to show today.
Awesome. Okay, I'm always up for being a bit more productive. So I'm just going to hand straight over to you if you want to share your screen.
Yeah.
Ladies and gents, Sancho.
Okay, so hello everyone, my name is Sancho Harker. I'm currently a solutions developer at Business Cloud Integrations, and I try and share as much knowledge as I can with everyone. So I'm also a Microsoft MVP, Power Apps champ, and Power Apps Forum super user. Don't like long intros, so I'll just leave it at that and go straight into the demo, because people don't like watching slides all the time when they're doing at work all the time. So let's get straight into the good stuff. So when you're doing Power Apps, Canvas apps, there's a lot of little things that you may not know, especially recent features that can help you. One of the ones that very recent is the search function. So let's say I've got this screen, I've got a variable called global. We really should rename this variable as soon as possible. And it's not currently set. So if I hit one of these buttons, it sets it to something. If I hit something else, it sets it to something else. Now, those don't match the buttons we've got there. So let's start with renaming the variable. Now, if we use the search function, we can see global, we really rename this variable ASAP. And we've used it in 20 different places inside the app. Normally, what we would do previously is we'd be going through and finding all those places by looking at the variable screen within the Canvas app, and then finding every place where it's defined, and then going and changing it individually. So let's start with the replace function. So we can replace this name with something else. So let's make it global. This is the variable you are looking for. And then we can just hit replace. And that immediately just zooms through and will replace it everywhere in the app. And we go look at our list of variables. The old variable is now gone because it's been replaced everywhere, and the new variable is now visible inside all these formulae. Now, that's great and all, but the search and replace function is a lot more powerful than that. So what we can actually do is we can look at what this is doing when it sets those values. So this one is setting the variable to 42. Fair enough. So what we can actually do is we can search for that whole piece of code and replace that whole piece of code with something else. We could make it do a notify, we could make it change the value. Essentially, we don't just have to replace a single piece of your app. We can replace whole structural pieces and functional pieces and replace them with something else. So for example, I don't want this to be a number anymore. I want this to be a true false value, as we've got in the app. So I'm going to say, for this one, it's going to set it to true and replace all of those. Okay, now, obviously that's going to break everything, because now we've got one side setting it as a Boolean true-false variable and another side setting it as a numeric value. So looking at the false value for this, we've got set this to that number, 1337. Now we can do the same thing, replace that with false, and hit replace all. And we have now effectively turned this variable from one type of variable, a numeric, to a Boolean. And that's, again, this is a small section of what you can really do with that power, because you don't necessarily have to just replace the value. You could replace the whole functionality. Let's say you've got a whole gallery that's being filtered. You could replace that with a completely different set of values and filters, or you could have a function that patches something. You can replace that with a completely different and more complex patch, instead of manually going through and altering each code one piece at a time. So that's really, really powerful. A lot of people don't really know about the search and replace function. It's fairly new. If you want to enable it, you go to your settings and then to upcoming features and put on search. So I think that's actually now gone GA, so you might not even have to do that anymore. But yeah, like I say, this is super, super powerful. And again, instead of having to do repeated actions, so don't do what we try and solve with the Power Platform. We try to solve things with the Power Platform where people are manually doing things one at a time, and we automate them. In the same fashion, don't go and edit in your Canvas apps one at a time. Wherever you can, automate it by doing a search and replace. So that's tip number one. Okay, the next one is form control. So forms, almost everyone, I'd say, uses forms that's in some way or other in their apps. It's just that it's the easiest way to deal with patching data in and out without having to write whole long patch statements. So especially for the entry-level makers, they're going to be doing this a lot. Now, you might have, for example, one control that you've styled and given a specific look that you're looking for. Okay, we're going to exclude the fact that you should be using a template. I'll give links to my template later. But if you have to do it this way and you've customized this control, but now you want all your other controls to look exactly like that. There's a few ways to do this. One, you can reference a single control and make all your properties point to that control, and then they all rely on that control, which does, in larger apps, create a bit of an overhead. But what we can actually do is replace it entirely. And I know people will probably be thinking, okay, well, that's obvious, but there is a way to do this without hassle. Again, you could use the search and replace method, sure. That's also one option, but another option is if I copy this and paste it in this one. Okay, now I've got both on the left there, you can see I've got the new name and the old name. What I can do is just take the old name, delete the old object, and then everything starts erroring because it's trying to reference the update of the card will be referencing that combo box, and various other things there will be complaining about the old item doesn't exist. So if you actually just paste back in that old name's value, done. So kind of like this is quicker than doing a search and replace, especially if you're doing it in this context. So in this case, I recommend doing it this way because it's very quick. Just copy out the old name, delete the old object, rename the new one to the old name, and then you can rename this to your newer name, and obviously all the formulas then automatically update. So if we go and look in the update property there, we can see it's referencing the newer name. So that's that's a really quick way to do a search and replace even faster in this particular context. So this is when replacing controls inside a form or anywhere else where you're replacing controls that you have laid out, designed, and prepared a certain type of control to look a certain way, and you want to replace it with another one. So it might be, for example, let's say you're moving everything to a template, you might have a lot of existing items that are sort of, let's call them basically branded. They're very much Power Apps colored. You can then replace those with these templated items by just doing this method. So that was that's tip number 2. Okay, so this one actually comes up quite a lot on the super user forums, and that is UPN versus email. Now I broke my Azure Active Directory account, which I only have one account in my personal tenant, last night, getting this right. So in your accounts in Active Directory, you have your user principal name, which is effectively your login name, and that's what you log into Windows or your Office 365 environment with. Okay, so what you also have is an email component to your account, and that is dealt with on Microsoft Exchange. And that has a primary SMTP address, and then you can have multiple alternate aliases. Now, in most companies, your user principal name, your UPN, will be the same as your primary SMTP address. But I can say at least 50% of the places I've looked at or been in, that is not the case. So what happens is you'll have a shortened form usually in the user principal name, because there might be some legacy application that is tied in for single sign-on. And so it, for example, in this one particular case, only limited account names to 9 characters or less. So the account names you logged in with have to be 9 characters, but then for the primary SMTP address, you had your full long multiple name email address. The problem comes in when you're referencing data or filtering in whatever data source, Dataverse, SharePoint. If you're trying to filter something by an email address, you need to filter by an email address. And this is a bit misleading because the user.email function is not the email address. It's the user principal name. So again, they should change this, but it is what it is. So the user.email function actually returns your user principal name. And to get the email address, you have to use the Office 365 users connector and get user profile based on that user principal name. So I can replace that with a user.email. Yeah. And then you can see the primary SMTP for this account is, well, it's called "This is why we check," because, for example, if you've got a gallery and you're trying to filter items by the person that is currently logged in, so you're using user.email, but in your data source, you're storing people columns, what it returns as the email address is the actual email address. So those two won't necessarily be the same thing. And so when you do these kinds of checks and filters, you need to check for both. So it's really not too complicated, but it's just do one check, which is using the Office 365 users check to get the actual email address, or double pipe is or in Power Apps Campus Apps, or is the actual UPN equal to, and then whatever address you're looking up. So that way you cover both bases, and since user principal names, UPNs, are unique, no one else can have that user principal name, and technically primary SMTPs are unique, although you can break your exchange by giving 2 people the same primary SMTP, but we'll not get into that today. But usually that will also be unique. And so as long as you just check for both of them, you got everything covered. That's tip number 3. Okay, so this one's a funny one. When you copy objects and paste them on a screen in Power Apps will be really smart about it. Not really. And it'll try offset it for you so that they don't land on top of each other. So for example, if I paste this, you can see it's offset slightly down and slightly to the right, which is fair because maybe you want to then move it around and you don't want to move the original object. But the problem is if I insert that on a new screen, it does the same thing. So if every time you paste, it keeps bumping it down to the right, and that includes from the initial copy. So I've copied it from this screen over here, and the original coordinate was 227, 256. In this screen, the first pasted one is 227.56. But then for every subsequent, it keeps offsetting it. Now, how do you get around that? Well, it's really easy actually. I'll give you an example of this one. Pasted, and it only offsets on the x-axis. I copy this one, and it's only offsetting on the y-axis. And then if I copy this one and paste it, it's in exactly the same place. So how have I done this? Really easy. Just make sure it's a formula. As soon as it's a formula, so whether it's a variable or a static value plus something. So in this case, I've got two variables and a long formula being referenced for each of them. So when Power Apps tries to copy that, it doesn't know how to offset that, so it just keeps the original formula. And that's great, because that's what we want when we're pasting it across multiple other screens, for example. And there's an easy way you can do this as well. Instead of having that whole long variable, if, for example, we want this x value, so I'll just use this one as an example. We want this x value to remain, but we want the y value to bump. We can just turn it into a formula by adding 0. And you can see there, when I hover over it, it's now determining it as a formula. So if I copy that, yeah, there we go. So now it's just pasting it, offsetting it vertically. And then you just do the same for the y values. So that is how you maintain fixed coordinates, or at least maintain the coordinates you want. It might not always be fixed when copy pasting. Okay, so that's tip number 4. So the dreaded word that everyone loves hearing, delegation. Delegation is always going to be a problem unless you're very, 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 very careful. And there's an easy way to test for it. So in here, I've got 2 galleries. And this gallery, let's start with this gallery. This gallery is just pointing to this data source called all data types, which is just a table with a bunch of records in it. Okay. This gallery is filtering that and looking for cat1 in single line of text 1. Now we can see there immediately it has warned us by giving 2 blue underlines that there is a delegation error with this. And I've seen this time and time again being ignored, and it might be fine now, but given enough time, eventually, once your number of records grows past the maximum delegable limit in the app, it will stop working, because the maximum you can reference, and if I go to my properties here, I'll show you, the maximum you can reference for this is 2000. So if I try set it to like 3000, it just tells you need to be between 1 and 2000. So once you hit over 2000 records, attempting to be returned by a non-delegable query, it will only read the first 2000. So that means if you've got critical data that's supposed to come in row 2001, that will not be included in whatever you've built. So if you want to test this, go the other direction. Set it down to 1 or 2. And you need to either refresh the data source, or you need to just get your formula to re-query that data source. And you can see there, even though there should be multiple examples showing in this, because it's not delegable, only one is showing. So immediately I know that I have created a potential issue by writing this formula, and once the maximum limit has been reached, this will no longer filter correctly, and you may lose the ability to view critical data. So Very important. So to test it, swing it all the way back to 1 or 2 records. That way, if you know that there's 4 records that should be returned and only 1 is showing, you've done something wrong in your formula and you need to find a better way of referencing it. Now, that's a whole topic in itself, so I'm not going to go into that right now, but effectively, for example, we could do a starts with, and then that column, and then the text we want it to start with. And there you can see, no longer having a delegation issue, we get all the results we want. Okay, so delegation is a whole long topic. I'm not going to get into that now because, time. Okay, so next tip, character map. So in Power Apps, sometimes you might need to use characters that you technically can't type when you're passing them through to other things. So for example, the tab character and carriage return or new line. You can't send those easily to another thing. So if you, for example, are sending a query to an API or maybe to an Outlook email, you can't include those by just popping in a few extra enter characters because it won't be interpreted on the other end. What you can do is use the char function to reference that and send it as a command, and it will then be interpreted correctly. So what I usually do for reference is I have a reference app somewhere and I do this where this looks at the ASCII table. So char uses the ASCII table. So there are 255 characters in the original ASCII table. We're not talking about Unicode here, we're talking ASCII. I have links to this, which I will include at the end, but you can see there's a bunch of different things that ASCII refers to. Number 10, for example, is a new line feed, and what we can do now is you do for all and then a sequence of characters, so it just iterates through 1 to 255, and for each of those give a character value and a number, and then we can just make a nice little gallery that shows us what each of them represent. And then I've just given a little slider here to increase the number of characters we're adding for each of those in this test piece of text. And so, for example, if I select character 10, which I know is the new line feed, and increase the number, you can see it is adding characters to that. Now, the text for this is just pulling from that table or using the table's value, which, so effectively you could just put char 10 in your string that you're, for example, sending to an email or to another API or something like that, and it will send a, well, depending on how it's interpreted, a carriage return value. So that is really useful when doing formatting and all sorts of other things. You can also do tab characters. So yes, that is tip number 6. 6, yes. Okay, so next one. Bloating of Canvas apps can happen really quickly, especially when you're using forms like this. And the way it happens, if I look at this one, for example, is technically for every card, in most cases, it will have something that holds the value, something that tells you what it is, a label that shows an error message, and a star label that tells you this is required or not. But we can actually just compress all of that, and instead of doing that, we can do, in this example, I've changed the top label to the original value, parent display name. So let me just go over here. So that is originally just parent display name. Change that to parent display name, and then we just do a check if parent are required, so if the data card is required and the length of the text is equal to 0, i.e. you haven't filled it yet, then add a star on the end. So if I had to type in there, all right, yeah, I need to do a new form. Right, there we go. What happens is this button here, I just made it do a submit of the form. When submitting the form, it will validate. Now you're used to seeing this. Instead, what I've done is I've moved both the required star and then I use char 10, as we just discussed, to insert a new line, and then if there is an error, display it. And then it changes the text to semi-bold as well, which is just a nice little thing you can do. It's not necessarily required. So if there is an error, make it semi-bold. If there's no error and was resolved, then go back to normal font weight. So immediately we've halved the number of controls required for every one of those. We've gone from 4 to 2. So that's in a total number of control count, which does affect performance of apps in the overhead. We've improved massively. Okay, so that is tip number 7, and then so this one is an interesting one. When you have a value that is a static value and not a formula, but it has comments in it, if you overwrite that value using the panel on the right here, just say goodbye to whatever you had else in there, because it doesn't understand that. So for example, in this transparency field, I've got this code which someone has written, which says, please don't ever delete this because it's the previous developer and we need it in case we need to revert changes, and also because Power Apps only keeps 90 days of changes, and this is from ages ago. So if you delete this, consider it your resignation. And yeah, if you didn't see that and you just changed the transparency to 1, yeah, it's gone. So how do we get around that? First of all. Okay, so another problem with Power Apps, occasionally the undo button does not work. So what I'm going to do, I'll show you exactly how I did it. So it was 0, we had a comment in there, please don't delete this. Now, you can see on the right here, when it's not grayed out, it treats it as a static value, so it's easily overwritten and you wouldn't know that there's that comment there. Again, like we did earlier with the fixed coordinate values, if we just turn it into a formula by adding 0, or if it's a Boolean value, then make it and true, or if it's, you get where I'm going with this. That way, when you try and override transparency, immediately it shows it as a formula, and you have to click into it, and it will take you straight to the formula bar. So no data loss. So that's really big. And then the last, time-wise, how am I doing, Sharon? Looks like might have a minute.
You're okay.
Okay. So the last one is not really a Canvas Power Apps tip, but a flow tip. So I've got this flow here that I made. And the idea is I've got whatever condition happens, I've got this scope. The scope does something, it gets all the items in this list. And then for each of the items, it's getting the individual item. And then I used a compose just because it's nice and easy to show you. But I've got an expression in here that references this get copy 1 field here, which if you've used flow enough, you'll know if I try copy this and paste it somewhere else, I'm going to have to go in and fix all of those because unfortunately, most of the time, the expressions do not auto update. So we copy it to the clipboard. Now, normally you go add an action and you go my clipboard and you, oh yeah, there it is, paste it in. But that has literally copied it to the clipboard. So what we can do is open up something like VS Code, and paste it. Now that's a mess. So hopefully you have something like the extension Beautify or some other kind of linting tool where you just, it'll format it for you. So we hit Beautify file, which is a function of the Beautify extension. And that nicely formats it all up for us, which is great. So now what I can do is the operation of the scope is called copy scope 1. I want to, that's now pasta scope 1. Then inside that scope, we have an action, and that action is called copy 1. So that's the original copy 1 we saw in the editor. Then we had one that's called get copy one, right? So if I open that up and search for get underscore, there we go. So inside that apply to each, we have an action called get copy one. Now, if I do a search for that, we can see it's referenced in 5 different locations. So it's like there, it's there, it's there. You don't need to worry about where it is, but we know that that's the name. And what these are going to be the expression values. So what I can actually do is replace that with a new name, custom copy one, and now select all of this, put it back into the clipboard with Control-C or copy, however you want to do it. And in the clipboard action here, I can paste from my clipboard. So if I hit paste, there we go. And now this has my modified scope. It has the modified lookup. And then inside each of the expressions, we can see, let me just make that a bit bigger. We can see it's now referencing the updated scope. So one, again, like the Power App search and replace, one search and replace to replace all of these instead of having to manually go through and fiddle with all of them. So yes, that is a pretty big tip for people who don't know about that. So let's move on here. So got a bunch of links. I will put these in the chat afterwards, and we'll probably put them in the YouTube video as well. So don't worry about clicking or getting those links. And just thank you very much for your time today. It's been a wild set of tips.
That's a great session. So, see, the good thing is, Sancho, you've definitely saved more time than you were speaking, right? So
yes.
always a good measure. No, that was awesome. And I kind of like the fact that everything is maths, right? Just stick a +0 on the end, happy day. Genius. Awesome. So Thank you again for everybody for coming. Thank you for listening. And we hope you enjoy the content that we're putting out. Please do come along and join the community. If you search for Cambridge Power Platform User Group, do come along and join as a member, and then you'll get notifications as things go live on YouTube and for the next event. But thank you ever so much, everybody, for coming along. It's great to be part of a community where technology is constantly evolving, not just around the Power Platform and our use of the Power Platform, but everything else that's going to come in and interact with the Power Platform too. So thanks to all of our speakers. Thanks to you all for attending. See you next time.